Well, hey, Roger, what's going on?
Hey, Scott, doing well. How are you doing?
Just living the scary part of the dream. We were talking about this beforehand, but all
yes.
the, employees changing around and making my life like kind of somewhat miserable, so just is where it is, man.
Yes. Seems like every day a different challenge.
Yeah, I know. And you have the same stuff too.
Yeah.
Same things with people quitting and doing their thing.
Yes.
Okay, so guys, we're going to talk a lot about what does the legal fine print actually say when we're thinking about post Nassar. You're going to have a lot more questions. We're going to expand the snot out of this. We have a bunch of questions. We're going to see how well we get through, about 45 minutes or an hour here. But I think it'll help you in a lot of ways with it too. So W.D. Wilson pitches, and I'm stripping it down a little because I can't put it all on the screen. Do you need the law of the land to be exposed by a fraudulent president before erasing all he did? Very, very good question. That's why I picked that puppy up here. I said, dude, we're going to hit that one. So how would you look at that particular question and answer that?
Well, first of all, I would start that by saying that we all come from the same perspective that the law of the land is our Constitution. It is the supreme law of the land. So we look to the Constitution for the various different elements in there. And even when you dive into the Constitution as it's written, there are certain requirements in there that deal with a whole variety of things that address the issue of a fraudulent president and then trying to erase the things that they've done. And I'm going to kind of jump in the middle of it by saying that if we look at our country, in addition to being a land of laws and having our Constitution as the supreme law of the land, one of the things the Constitution prescribes is that those who are elected to the Congress and the president must take an oath of office. And, what's interesting is if you dive into the recent oaths of office, and I understand there's a couple of court cases out there, the Brunson case being one and some other considerations. But if you really dive into the oath of office, what is the oath of office? Well, the oath of office states that as an elected official, that you will uphold the Constitution of the United States, the supreme law of the land, and you will also swear to uphold the laws of our country, which are Congress-made laws and a variety of other things that come into play, that you would preserve and protect the Constitution and the fabric of our country against enemies, foreign and domestic, and that you will, as an elected official, your first duty will be to our Constitution.
Right.
So just for briefly going over those. So if I take a look, for example, at an oath of office, one of the things I noticed in particular, I went back and took a look at the last few inaugurations and watched the presidents who were elected sign their oath of office. And what was interesting.
When does that happen? Is it right before the 12 o'clock time frame, or is it?
Actually, what happens is they get sworn in at 12:01, and then they go through their speech and presentation. From that point, then they go into the Capitol building.
Oh, that's right.
Before they do everything else, they go to the president's room, which is on the Senate side of the Capitol building, and they have a ceremony where the president-elect, who is now president, sits at a table and signs the oath of office. And so, for example, there are, in the ones you look at previously, there's basically 3 oaths of office that take place. Okay, so there's one for the archive, there's one for Congress, for the Library of Congress, and then there's a third one then that goes with the president. Now, what's interesting, if you look at these and you do a zoom into these, one of the things I noticed with President Trump and with prior presidents is you can actually see that what they are signing is a paper that has words on it, what is actually a representation or a repetition of the oath, if you will. What's interesting with Biden, when he was in there signing it, it was blank pages. The second thing I noticed is that with former presidents, all of their families and a large number of the congressional House and Senate folks are around there. With Biden, everybody's standing 6 feet apart. So nobody can see what he's signing because
isn't that hysterical?
Seeing a signature from a distance apart. Okay, so that's got to be a tip off that, okay, he didn't sign it. The other part of it is that given that the swearing in took place at 11:47 and the Constitution says 12:01, he was in violation of the Constitution even when he took the oath of office. So therefore, starting out that way places him at a disadvantage of being legal.
Right. I mean, this is not a perfect, picture of it, but basically this is, that like LBJ, when he, obviously he takes over office in a very strange circumstance, but that might be when he would have taken over the oath of office kind of thing, right?
Yes. So they actually, okay. So with LBJ, so he had the swearing in on the plane when they were coming back from Dallas.
Correct.
But then also he had to sign an oath of office in front of a judge. So that's the important part, because you take the oath and then you have to sign that document.
Right.
Anyone who's ever been an elected official will tell you that once they go for their ceremony, they are sworn in. They put their hand in the Bible and raise and take the oath. The next thing they do is they sign their oath of office.
Right.
And that has to be witnessed by the clerk, let's say, or somebody in the authority to do that in a local office, or the secretary of a House or Senate, or however that is set up. If it's the governor, it's usually a Supreme Court justice in the state. So you go through the processes to make that oath of office binding on the individual who is claiming the office. Now, what's interesting is that there's been a lot of discussions whether or not these folks have really signed an oath of office. And there's a couple of different ways you can look at that. You can say, okay, so if we're going to rely on the oath of office as being your linkage between upholding the supreme law of the land or not, if you haven't taken the oath of office, then technically you're not an elected official who has taken a oath of office and eligible to serve.
Right.
So that's one series of considerations. The next series of considerations is that if we take a look at the process whereby people are, where they certify the elections.
Right.
When we have an election, we go through a process where at the local level, the votes are counted. They go through a certification process where they review the numbers and they certify that they are true and accurate based on the ballots that were cast. And once that certification takes place, then it goes to usually the Secretary of State's office, who then, if it's a federal office, will then forward that information to the Congress. And
Right.
so, again, we have to take a look at this. And because there is a cloud over the election itself, again, you have the question as to whether or not these folks were truly capable of being certified in their election.
Well, so let's step that one.
So I'll stop there for just a minute.
No, let's step back. So, for
Sure.
instance, this is, I mean, if you just research a little bit, like I remember when this first came out, I mean, this kind of picture came out. This is right when he's signing executive orders. So this would be a little bit later. But the whole conversation is very common. These are blank pages that we
Yes.
saw for the executive orders, that stacks of executive orders that would have been off right over about here that they didn't want to say. And he said during the debates in 2020, I'm not going to sign a whole bunch of executive orders. That would make me a despot. And then he, I mean, all this stuff. And then they have to have, when you have to have fact checker kind of groups to tell us that what we see isn't what we see, and you're like, okay, that's fine. But what I guess what I'm thinking about right in here too is that so we have the potential of several issues that go on. First off, was the election really done correctly in November of 2020? It never went to a Supreme Court. Well, sort of did, but they, kept, shoving it down, even though the evidence was very, very overwhelming, way more than the Gore Bush one in 2020 or 2000, excuse me. And then we move forward to January 6th that, that no one wants to spend any time on, like, what was their job, which is the Brunson case. And then we move forward to the day and he's signing, he's taking his oath of office, 9, 10, 12 minutes, whatever it is, beforehand. He, he doesn't really sign the oath of office, or signs some blank form. On top of it, they have a supposed 21 gun salute that's not a 21 gun salute. on top of, and then, they even had the doors that were locked
Right.
to the White House as they walked up to the White House and looking all stupid, looking around going, I don't know, and you're like, guys, do you understand? Like, there's levels that they were trying to tell you of the fraudulent nature with that.
Yes, and again, I go back to some of the elements that you spoke of, but actually, some other ones here. If you look at the inauguration of the president, it's think of the terms pomp and circumstance. Okay, so if you sit here and look at pomp and circumstance, okay, so you have the ceremonial things that take place, like with the music and the military and the salutes and all that. I'll call that the pomp side of it, and the circumstance being, and it's probably not a good analogy to use, but the circumstance being the facts that we're looking at in this case. So if we separate that out and we say, okay, so inauguration early, signing blank sheets of paper for an oath, under questionable circumstances with regard to the election. You go back and look at the history of how the election took place on November 3rd and the following days, and you look at all the different aspects of that have taken place. Yes, there is a cloud that hangs over the president, or I should say the lowercase president, the person who is acting as a president.
The corporation.
And you have that same cloud that hangs over the members of Congress, the lowercase c.
Sure.
So again, which is also part of the corporation. So if you take a look at those things, imagine that we were a country moving forward where most people didn't realize there was a corporation acting on top of our republic and they were controlling everything. What 2016, 2017 did was they split that into a fork in the road.
Yeah.
One fork of the road went down the republic aisle, one fork went down the corporation aisle. And so what we did with what we saw with the assistance of the news media is the focus on the corporation side,
right?
And they ignored the republic side. And so with the corporation side, they were able to do all these things that were inconsistent with the republic side. So even though we had the supreme law of the land and the Constitution, they essentially were saying, we don't have to pay attention to that because we're over here on the corporation side. And after all, the board of directors and the chairman of the board control the corporation. And at that point, that was Biden and the members of the Congress.
But I think that one thing that, and I know you know this, and I'm bringing it up for people, some people look at it and go, yeah, but how do I see the corporation versus, the republic side? There's a really, really simple answer. And this kind of came to me in 2020 when I was thinking about this, is every time they talked about democracy, they were telling you corporation. And frankly, I went back in history and realized every time CIA types of things would tell you we're bringing democracy to Grenada, an old 80s issue. We're bringing democracy. That was no, we're bringing the corporation to them instead of republic.
That's correct. And if you take a look, for example, at the pledge, this is a real simple thing. So the reason that the people that are supporters of the corporation wanted to get rid of the pledge was because it's the Republic of the United States of America. Whereas their approach would have been the democracy of the United States of America, because that's how they separate the corporation from the Republic. They call it something it's not. And so,
but also there's a possibility that we heard very clearly that on July 4th of 2020, so months and months and months before the new Constitution, the Constitution was brought back out of the corporation, and it's a very, no one wants to talk about that one because we haven't actually seen it, pulled away from the 1871 change, the grammatical changes to say, the Constitution of the United States instead of the Constitution for the United States, but if there was a new declaration and constitutional signing at that time frame, they can't sign their oaths of office. Is that possible too?
Yes, that is also true, because again, our nation did not come to an end. Our nation continued to go forward. The republic continues forward.
Right.
What came to an end was the corporation. And where people have a hard time understanding that is that they they listen to what the mainstream news media has told them. And this whole concept of a corporation is foreign to a lot of people. I mean, the corporation went bankrupt. It was
Right.
liquidated. So you sit here and you look at this. I mean, I can go back to the beginning days of 2020 when we were dealing with all of these relief packages because of the so-called pandemic. If you take a look at all of the information that was contained in there and all of the money that was given away without it having to be repaid, they were basically giving away funny money to organizations that were helping them move forward and do things when in reality, the corporation was teetering on the verge of bankruptcy. Now, in most situations, a bankruptcy judge would have said, oh, wait a minute, you can't give away the money if you're in bankruptcy.
Right.
So at that point in time, they were getting resources from someplace else to give money to organizations, businesses, and NGOs. But at the end of the day, there were a lot of things contained in those relief bills that signify the fact that we are moving away from this corporation-controlled republic to an independent republic free of the corporation.
Well, you're talking more specifically about the CARES 2 Act.
Yes.
The CARES 2 Act had snot loads of stupid in there. You know, like, I mean, I'm going to make it up here, but basically, it's like, you know, painting the walls of the art museum in essence, and you know, millions of dollars for upgrades of that stuff. And I'm like, aren't we in the middle of a pandemic? So like, why do you need to paint the walls over there? You know, kind of thing. And that was more code, I think, to tell you that Congress was passing something that had nothing to do with the real Americans, that was going in to a corporation level pocket because the PPP loans defunded the Fed in essence.
Yes. Well, in addition to that, if you look at the fine print in those two particular bills, the CARES Act, and there was a one in between called CRISA, and then there was a third one called ARP, which was the recovery plan. And all of those had some unique things in them. Number one, you couldn't be spending the money on capital. You had to pay for lost wages. You had to pay for services. You had to pay for reimbursements of a variety of things.
Right.
And so
I remember that one. Yeah.
It was all liquid. And it was liquid with the intent that, you know, they were never expecting the money back. The interesting thing is if you look around in state government today, a lot of people don't realize this, but coming up at the end of this year, if you have leftover ARP funds, they're supposed to be sent back to the Treasury. So the states have been in a furious spending spree to try and give all that money away so none of it has to go back to Washington, which is kind of interesting because if the corporation is bankrupt, you would think that the judge would say, okay, all this money has to come back, because if we're truly going through a bankruptcy like the corporation is, you want to account for your assets and you want to identify how you're going to pay your debtors. Well, the problem is we have such a huge debt. There's not enough money here to pay for that. So we have certain steps of the process we have to go through before we enter that next phase.
That's such a funny thing. Okay, so I know we went off on a great topic, guys. I mean, Roger and I can go do this for hours with that too, but we don't want to mess with you too much because it's such a gorgeous point. So we have a fraudulent president, and that's and Roger was the first one that kind of said, I don't think 25th is going to come up. Isn't that right? Didn't you say that?
Okay, so it could come up, but if you look at how the constitutional language states,
even if we had time for it, though,
even if he had time for it, I mean, there's still an opportunity for him to object. And here's the interesting thing: Congress has gone home, the House and the Senate. So again, you know, we're recording this on the 22nd. So we sit here and we look at 9 days. Every member of Congress, their term is over with. They have to be called back to Washington to be able to take action.
Right.
If we look at that 9-day period, 1/3 of the Senate is over with. So we only have 2/3 of the Senate remaining until we get to January 3rd. And so that's when they have the swearing in for the new Congress. So again, from a calendar perspective, we don't have time. Now, if you don't do the 25th Amendment, they could still do some kind of a declaration of war and say that we're gonna invoke, you know, Martial law, we're gonna declare war against somebody, or somebody's going to attack us, so we have to declare war. The president has that responsibility to do that, again, under the War Powers Act, until the Congress comes back in session. So a lot of this is just, these are just things hanging out there that people could kind of pull out of the sky if they wanted to kind of explain why we might see what we might see. But I do believe in reality, what we're looking at is we're moving forward toward the next important date, January 3rd, when folks get sworn in, and then January 6th, and what happens around January 6th. Well, setting that aside for just a moment, we still go back to the fact that we have this individual who is claiming to be president, and they were not elected in a legitimate way. We have members of Congress who claim that. And what, again, if you can think about this in multiple levels, one of the other things we have going out there that's been news that's been broken over the last week or two, Patrick Byrne came out and identified the relationship between the Smartmatic machines and Venezuela. And one of the things he indicated was that he spent time at the manufacturing concern in Los Angeles that makes these machines. And he said out of 100 machines, there was one of them that had the Smartmatic name on them. The other 99 had different types of stickers put on them, but they all did the same thing. Every single one of those machines was controlled by Venezuela,
right,
and by Maduro and his people. So they had the ability to flip the elections in 72 countries over the course of the last 8 to 10 years. They flipped the results in those countries, allowing the people who lost to actually win. So with that being out there, and with consideration, if you look at the information that was found by Tina Peters, the two sets of documentation before and after, there is clearly an ongoing move here where they were trying to convince the public that look here, don't look there, because if you look over there, you're going to see the results are different than what we tell you they are. So the evidence is beginning to come out to demonstrate the fact that 2020 was stolen, 2018, 2022, and we know 2024 was stolen because we look at the 3 congressional races in California just as an example, and they kept counting and finding ballots until they went from Republican to Democrat. So
yeah, and there were like 22 up, one guy's 22 up or some stupid number, and you're going, come on, that's a runoff level.
Yes. So, you sit here and you pull these things apart, and what you see, again, getting back to the oath of office, you have to be legitimately elected, number one, to take that oath of office. If you take an oath of office and you're not legitimately elected, the question becomes, have you committed perjury? Yes, because the oath of office is a statement that says, I swear and affirm to this information. And so now you have committed perjury, which again is
just
another issue that undermines.
Just by signing your name. Even if you sign your name on a blank document as Joe Biden, that's just the same level of that.
Yes. I mean, and then if you have an actor who's playing it, then the question becomes, okay, what validity goes to that? So back to that original question, how do we deal with everything that's taken place over the course of the last 4 years?
Well, so that leads us to the next point. What constitutes treason on a republic, which I think we've already answered, by whom and what penalties. So we have this weird thing that's out there in the Constitution. Article 3 talks about, in the 3rd section here, so we have treason against the United States consists of levying war against them, adhering to their enemies, basically going, with whatever they want to do, and aid and comfort. No person convicted of treason unless testimony of 2 witnesses, same act, confession of open court, and it goes on with that kind of thing. But, we've got an issue of, holy cow, this is a big deal. And it's a very specific, person who could actually do that. I mean, as some citizen, I'm not going to sit there and have the ability to create war necessarily.
Well, but see, here's the interesting part. It really doesn't have to be creating war. It gets down to, where is your allegiance as an American citizen? Is your allegiance with the Republic of the United States of America? Or is it with the corporation? Or
Which
is it with a foreign country who is trying to overthrow the Republic government? And if we take a look at our government, the Republic of the United States, the citizens in this country swear allegiance to that. If we look at everybody else, whether you're a kneeler at a game or whether you're someone who goes out and says, you know, I'm pushing for the overthrow of the country, I'm supporting candidates who are looking to overthrow the country, all of those people now get roped into the group of those who are engaging in treasonous behavior. Now, under the Constitution, one of the ways out of that is to say, well, hey, I never intended that. You know, but the reality is your actions speak louder than your words. And so therefore, by you doing everything from voting for these people, giving money to them, working for their election, standing up and supporting the things they do, I mean, you're very, very close to being roped into that treasonous behavior that seeks to undermine our Constitution. And again, going back to the question that was asked, what do we do about the laws? Well, again, we have to look to a higher authority, in this case, the Supreme Court, that basically says that, look, these people overthrew the government. They committed treason to become lawmakers. And so therefore, any of the actions that took place under this, in quotes, administration of Biden and the rest of them are invalid.
Right.
Because you cannot have valid activities going forward. The interesting thing is even if you look at the reauthorization or the renewal of the executive orders by President Trump, 13848, 13818, and several others, those were reauthorized by our Joe Biden.
Right.
So the question becomes, did those have to be reauthorized the way they were, or was that a stunt to show that President Trump is still president?
Correct. Yeah.
And so, and then again, I want to kind of branch off of that a bit. If you look at the fact that, you know, we have referred to him as the commander in chief. It's commander in chief of the military, and the military, if we're under military law, the commander in chief is running the country. And so if we are under a military operation at this point, President Trump, as commander in chief of the military, is directing the military to oversee this country and the things that are going forward. And the corporation is using their little p president, Biden, to run around and do all the things that he's doing. So therefore, anything the little p and little c of Congress do becomes invalid. So
and to support your point here, so we have, you know, these really fun executive orders that support your point here.
Yes.
So you want to talk a little bit about EO 13818, and then we'll show 848 here in a second.
Yes. So yes. So these have to do with anyone who is acting against the interests of the United States by trying to overthrow elections, by trying to manipulate the outcome of elections, and then 13848 has to do with human trafficking and child trafficking. So we sit here and look at these, and those have actually been identified as things that go against the government in part because there's money involved, there is corruption involved, there's fraud involved, there is government officials playing a huge, well, I should say government officials, members of the administrative state and elected officials who have some role to play in this, either by being direct participants, receiving kickbacks, receiving campaign finances and contributions, a whole variety of other things. So what you have here with these two executive orders is you have a situation where, again, that's one of the tracks that's kind of running parallel with what we're involved with right now. And when President Trump signed these executive orders, the purpose was to put the public on notice.
Right.
Most of the public remained asleep, but to put the public on notice that, look, our elections are in jeopardy. Our population is in jeopardy because of human trafficking, child trafficking, because of a whole variety of different things. And we have people in our government, in our leadership in the Congress and the president, in the states, and private individuals engaging in all this activity here, which is working against the interests of the United States and against the interests of the Republic. And that's how we get to the point of saying that we have a whole group of people out there that are at war with the United States, the Republic of the United States. And so when we look at that and we look at the potential impact of that, what we see is that we see a lot of people here struggling through trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to address this? Who's going to decide what happened? Who's going to decide whether or not there's any penalty or justice for what happens? And again, where the fine line is here is that you look at things like treason. Treason is one of those things that can either be tried in a civil or criminal court, or if you have a military tribunal, it would be taking place there. And anyone who's paid any attention at all about Gitmo knows that that's expanded. They know the United States has places offshore where they also have prisons and places where tribunals can take place. Some of our military vessels have been participating in ongoing tribunals because of the decisions of people connected with the pandemic. So there's a lot of background activity going on that the president has spoken about, but really hasn't confirmed its existence. He's talking about the fact that there will be a price to pay for people who engaged in this activity, and we'll see what that is. Right. And so, again, if we look at the concept of the military tribunals, those are for the people who engaged in giving allegiance to some country other than the Republic of the United States. Now, when I say something other than the Republic of the United States, if you seek to overthrow the government, then you're guilty of treason.
Right.
If your intent of supporting somebody is because you know they're going to do it, same thing. Okay, so we have a situation where we have a lot of potential individuals who will fall under the umbrella of treason and therefore subject to military tribunals.
Okay, right. I would agree with that. Yeah. Okay, so what you're talking about, though, is the 14th Amendment under the third section more specifically. So we'll bring that one up just for the heck of it, because that is related to where you're talking about for those guys, right?
Yes, yes. And what's interesting is that in our country, if you are a citizen of this country, and I say a citizen because that's the key defining moment there, you are protected by the Constitution. So you have certain rights under the Constitution. Under the Bill of Rights in particular, you have a freedom of speech, freedom of association. Under the Fourth Amendment, you have a freedom for protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. You have a right for bail. I mean, there's a lot of different rights that you have as an individual in this country. However, once you make a decision to become an enemy combatant of this country by joining those who seek to overthrow the government, then you place your rights in jeopardy. And so, for example, you might have a situation where somebody says they go to the common law, the Supreme Court, as the Supreme Court of the land, and they want an emergency appeal there saying, I have a right to my rights protected under the Bill of Rights as an enemy combatant. And right. What'll happen is the court will go through that and they will humor the person who's raised the issue. And I say humor because there have been several court cases that have looked at that. And what it gets down to is intent. And if your intent was to become an enemy combatant, then guess what? You forego your rights under the Constitution. If you look at the military tribunals that are covered under the Law of War Manual, there are also discussions about what types of rights you have going forward. Sure, you can confront your accusers, which again is going to be military JAG officers. You can confront the government who has their evidence against you, and they will have evidence against you because they've been collecting all the data. And so you have certain rights in there, but again, the question is going to become, are you the ringleader under the treasonous activity that becomes eligible for the death penalty? Or are you a supporter who becomes eligible for life in prison? And so you've got those elements floating around out there that are also considerations in this bigger discussion of treasonous behavior and what happens with the laws that we've had to endure over the last 4 years that were allegedly passed by a Congress and signed into law by a fake president.
Right. Which is so funny. I mean, that's why you have to arrest him. That's why my feeling has been, and I didn't know all this. I've been learning it as we speak too, and we're seeing it unfold. So it's a little hard to always know everything that's going to happen. But, the 25th Amendment actually didn't have as much meaning, to me at least, than anything else that they did. I mean, Trump brought it up, but if he's not a legit president, then how do you really 25th a guy?
That's true. You can't.
So it's kind of like, oh, okay, well, that's great. Then lets him retire. And yet some people saw it that way. They had that Clydesdale response, not to see everything that was out there. And
Yes.
I'm like, so when we think about like what kinds of laws are these public grievances, what kinds of things are we looking at? What are more specific kind of things that we're looking at with president, with Senate, Congress kind of thing?
I mean, for example, we take a look at we take a look at the laws that they have passed. I mean, for example, one of the laws that they did early on is that they wanted to let the Trump tax cuts expire.
Oh, okay.
Now, I know this is going to sound crazy to people, but I would like to argue the fact that if we declared that action to be unconstitutional and unreasonable, then any additional taxes that were collected as a result of those tax increases expiring were unlawfully collected and therefore need to be returned to the people.
Oh my gosh.
Okay, like I said, I'm just going to throw that out. That's one example of where you look at the impact of what they did, because if a law becomes unconstitutional, you have to stop enforcement, and then you have to return people to the position they were had the law not been enacted.
Oh my gosh.
So if you just
amazing.
think about that element alone, to me, I think that kind of sort of feeds into the discussion under Nacera where you talk about getting rid of the IRS. Because the question then becomes, if we look at that, and then we go back to someone who's going to say, well, wait a minute, if we're using that as the basis for our argument, why can't we go back to the 1900s and take a look at how the income tax came about?
Right.
What about going back to the creation of the Fed? What about going back to all these other types of things that took place and raising the question, if it was not done under our republic, then how can the citizens of our republic be forced to pay for the illegal crimes against the republic?
Well, it reminds me of I'll say this kind of briefly, but I had an agreement, an original agreement with a manufacturer for a loan, and it was very restrictive. And frankly, when I signed it in 2005, I didn't realize the restrictive nature of it. But again, they were giving me funding. I was okay with it for the time frame. When I moved in 2009 and I was working with the same manufacturer, there's the lawyer that was working, his name is Scott. And so, he always had to get Scott and Scott together to, figure out what we were doing. And one of the points of redress that it would say is if you default on the loan, normally, if you default on a loan, they kind of tell you, okay, Scotty, you default on the loan, then we're going to do X, Y, and Z against you, in essence. Okay. And yet what was funny is they said, if you default on the loan, we're going to go back to an old agreement and we're going to take those remedies against you. And I said, we're not in the United States of Iraq. You can't take old remedies that you're killing off in the new loan. I mean, you can't take old remedies and forward those into this loan here. I'm not letting you do that. And that's the kind of thing we're talking about here, is that level of, wait a second, you're adding thing after thing. That's why we can strip away a lot of the stuff that's been happening since the Fed and IRS and all those other things came in vogue.
Yes, and again, my comment on the Trump tax cuts and the potential impact of that is, the reason that's important is because you need something to open the door to start the argument.
Right.
And again, if you take a look at the decisions by the Congress to who is not a legitimate body because they didn't have a legal basis for taking an oath of office. Some people will argue that, well, if you take the oath without signing the oath, it's still the oath. Well, it is, but it isn't. Because if you take an oath without signing the oath and you're not a legitimate oath taker because you weren't properly elected, then everything you've done gets undermined. It gets invalidated. So
invalidated, right? Yeah.
if we take a look at, if we say merely taking an oath constitutes the basis for being there, that we can pick up any number of people off the street, have them take the oath of office, and now they're our Congress. And
Well,
that
yeah,
doesn't
I mean,
make any sense to anyone.
I can't walk into the sheriff's station, take an oath of office to be the sheriff, the Tulsa County Sheriff, and suddenly become the Tulsa Sheriff. I mean, I wasn't allowed. I mean,
That's correct.
I'm walking in there and doing that. You can't walk in to my company and say, I'm the owner of the company. I'm gonna, and then start like opening up credit card, amounts for under the company. No, you don't get to do that because
No, you don't.
you are the fraud in that circumstance.
And then we go back to the fact that fraud vitiates consent. If you engage in fraudulent activity, then there was no consent. So therefore, every act you've taken becomes invalidated. And, again, it's like with the last time around when I talked about corrupt judges making decisions that the judge had absolutely no basis to make. And if you find out that the judge actually had ethical issues or broke the law in doing some type of activity, and they're sitting here rendering impartial justice, which it's not, then the courts have actually set aside the verdicts in those cases.
Right.
And they permitted the opportunity for someone to go forward and seek redresses. Now, what's interesting, if you take any person who claims to be an elected official, again, they are protected by their official acts as an elected official. If they're not an elected official and properly sworn in, and they're not properly elected, they have no official acts. Everything they do is unofficial. Therefore, they subject themselves to claims against them. So if you look at all the money that's transpired and moved around for, say, elections, you look at the fact that people have taken salaries, they've invested in stocks and everything else, everything that they have and have accumulated is referred to as ill-gotten gains because they never should have been there in the first place. And so,
Which means
again,
that
that's part of
everything from 2018, from what you just said, and you and I've talked about this from 2018, 2020, 2022, 2024, it's all gone.
It's gone. And so, again, if we take a look at these people and the impact of the executive orders on them, President Trump has already said your property will be seized and become the property of the Republic of the United States of America. So for example, what does that mean for that property coming back to the government? What that means is that now the government has a resource available to reimburse people that have had justice denied, that have been hurt, that have been harmed because of the vaccines. I mean, there's just a whole litany of other types of things you can begin to look at by taking someone's gain that was ill-gotten and using it to compensate victims. And so that's why I say when you start looking at this, there are so many different levels of conversation that have to take place.
Right.
If you stop and think about it, it gives you a headache. You almost have to start mapping it out on paper to try and identify how this is going to go, and then who's going to be making the decisions and how that process is going to go forward. And that's why when President Trump talks about no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, commissions, everything else, you have a situation where that's one way of returning to the people what never should have been taken in the first place. The second way is that you have all these folks that are harmed, whether we're talking the J6ers or the people who are harmed by the vaccines. Again, you're going to have to compensate those folks. Then you have all of the people who lost relatives because of the vaccines, all the people who lost jobs. You have so many people who have been harmed who are now victims of this illegitimate regime that there has to be some way to try and set things correct for them.
Well, and
that becomes
also
a long process to go through.
Well, there's also the Bill Gates lands that he's taken.
Yes.
And that one way, I mean, NESARA, its basis in that is in the farming kind of thing. So very simple, circumstance is to say we're giving those farms, those particular plots of land back to the farmers in that kind of situation. So,
Yes,
and I think there's and by the way, that's good for the country in a million ways,
it
because
is.
now we have private farmers who are going to grow amazing crops, who then can bring them to market, and you go, wait, my food starts getting better because we don't get Monsanto and all the other ones in the middle of the process.
Yes, and we're not adulterating the foods with all these other types of chemicals and genetically modified organisms and everything else that's out there. So, this is a very complex process going forward. And, as the saying goes, it's going to take a while to undo it. It's like a giant rubber band ball. You take
It
one
is.
rubber band off at a time to try and expose what lies underneath it. And it's almost like that giant rubber band ball that's got a coating of plastic on it that's starting to be peeled apart.
Right.
And when we get to that, then we'll see how that pulls apart and how we address those things.
Well, I think where we're going here, guys, is in a couple days you're going to open up presents, right? My dog Dax loves to open up presents. Okay, it's one thing that she loves doing, and it's almost painful to watch her strip away tiny little strips of the paper, right? So think about that, or if you've had a little kid who wants to strip away little tiny bits of the paper with that too. In essence, that's what we're doing before we even get to the present. Now, I'm one of those people that's not talk. I don't believe that everyone's going to suddenly have millions of dollars, and basically blow up the economy in that way. But I have kind of put aside, a possibility of, hey man, what if the last 3, 4, 5, 7 years, whatever, income tax comes back to people? Pretty big deal. That might be a huge issue with that too. But the reality is you have to get after the redress that Roger's talking about, like the J6ers or the vaccine injuries that have happened. Those kinds of things are going to have to be done. And that's kind of why you have, 13818. But it also has to go into what we call, there are actual trusts out there that were built in the NESARA thing to deal with that. And so these are being paid back, and that's where you get the cancellation of the debts and other things like that.
Yes, and not only do I agree with that, but I want to take that one step further as we look at trying to identify where things are going to take place. If we look at the executive orders that President Trump has talked about doing on his very first day in office, that's a starting point. And so if we get 35, 50, whatever the executive orders are going to be, that starts immediately there. And then we take a look at the fact that we have the cabinet that's coming in. And the question becomes, how do we address the issue with the cabinet? Do we wait around for them to be sworn in, or do we ask for an adjournment and say that, we want the president to exercise his powers under Article 3 and
Section 2. Yeah.
I'm sorry, Article 2, Section 3, to go through and adjourn.
2, 3, right. Yeah.
Go through and adjourn the Congress to make this happen. I've even seen scuttlebutt out there where they've said recently, well, we should actually have one of the first things that the Congress does is to backdate the effective date of the presidency for President Trump, which again is something else out there. But again, all of these things are going to trigger lawsuits by the other side. And
Sure.
That lawfare activity will try and move that process forward. So we have to, knowing what's there, we have to have faith that things are going to work out. We have to hope for the right kind of outcome and do what we can, either through prayer or through getting right with God, or doing whatever we can to try and continue to help doing the good things we do while this process moves forward, because that's going to help us as a nation to get to a better place. And I think that's part of the important process that a lot of people have not thought about. If anything, people today should be looking at, how do I strengthen my faith? How do I get to a position where I can do what I can to make a difference? in the overall picture of our country, because we're going to need a lot of faith and a lot of hope and a lot of love to get through what's coming up in the next number of months.
Well, and I think the one thing I keep going back to, I mean, you just said in Hebrews 11:1, faith is the substance of things hoped for and the promise of things unseen. But the reality that we're trying to build in you is that substance. Some of the versions don't really pull it this way, but they, kind of says the evidence of, so faith is the evidence, the thing that you can hold on to that sustains your hope with that too. It's a very, very powerful kind of point here. And I would say you have to deal with this militarily. And we are going to come back to this. By the way, we're going to end it here today, but we are going to come back and address this one here much more specifically. And then we're going to move into these kinds of questions that will help you kind of see some of the future, because you have to deal. I've said this quite a few times. You have to deal with the stuff that has been going on since, and which means fix 2020. You have to deal with that. And you just can't run into the next term with Trump without having dealt with the past. That's not going to happen, because then you run into what Roger's talking about. They'll just bring up court cases and they'll just put roadblocks everywhere, and we won't get anywhere. We'll have to be stuck. That's why I believe a military tribunal has to be out there with that too. So do you have a last kind of point in there?
Yes, I agree with that, but I also want to mention the fact that if we go through the process here where we talk about the sealed indictments and the number of people that get arrested and the number of people that are taken into custody, again, running parallel with the deportations, I think we're going to find a lot of the people who might be prone to file lawsuits, not able to file lawsuits because, they're standing in detention someplace else. And so the net result is that could enable some of the processes to move forward the way they should.
Well, I mean, there's a boomerang effect when you bring up a lawsuit. I mean, like if Scott brings up a lawsuit against Roger and claims things, and I'm trying to get redress from Roger, if I bring up fraudulent level things in there, Roger can go, fine, you want to bring that puppy up? I'm going to shove some stuff on you, and I'm going to take it out of your hide, in essence. And that becomes like, whoa, wait a second, I don't want any of that. Well, guess what? You brought it to me. You made me take my time. It's going to cost you. And I think that's what also occurs here. Those things might just go whoop in just a half a second.
Yes, and when they say beware the boomerang, there's always a boomerang in everything, because the people who are instituting the lawfare against President Trump and others are going to find out that they're going to be facing the very same thing, only worse. Right. If you look at most of the opinions by the courts, those opinions are going to wreak havoc with the other side and what they tried to do, because they are not only going to impact them, but they will impact them far worse, because they're actually guilty of what they accuse President Trump of doing and others.
Right.
So that's going to be the interesting comeback on that. And that's why I say it's important for us not to lose hope, not to lose faith, stay in prayer and make certain that we're right with God as we go forward, because that's going to help us get through this. It's going to give us the strength that we need to be able to make certain that we can come out on the other side of this.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. Well, thank you guys. I really appreciate listening in. I love having Roger on. We kind of knew when we pulled these questions up, we were like, can we get through this in one time? Like, heck no, we're not going to be able to get through that. That's okay. Guys, it's gonna be okay. You can kind of go to drscottyoung.com. You can kind of get on and download some information. You can be over at the Telegram channel if that's something that's interesting for you with that too. But realize your heart is the final issue. The reason why I'm up at 3 to 5 in the morning, it's more like 3 to 4 a lot of times, is just to be in prayer, because I mean, life is just hitting me between the teeth. And I know Roger's up in prayer as well. And so, keep us in that prayer time, but also, keep yourself centered so that you can handle the fiery darts of the enemy. Thanks so much, guys.
Thank you very much.